Irony tastes bitter on a porcelain plate, especially when served alongside champagne at Seattle's most exclusive biotech gala, where your soon-to-be ex-husband is being honored for a breakthrough drug you helped conceptualize in your kitchen 5 years ago. I'm Rebecca Mitchell, Becca to those who know me. And tonight, my husband of 26 years informed me he's filed for divorce as we watched his name being etched onto the Innovation Award I can partly claim credit for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I think we've grown apart, Drew whispered, his voice barely audible over the applause. I've already spoken with my attorney. You'll get notification this week. The champagne flute trembled in my hand as industry colleagues smiled and nodded at us. The perfect power couple. Him in his tailored tuxedo, me in the emerald gown he'd insisted I buy for this event. If they only knew. Here? You're doing this? Here? I managed to keep my voice steady, a skill perfected through decades of playing the supportive wife at countless corporate functions. Drew's eyes darted around the ballroom. I thought a public place would help keep things civil. Civil. As if there were anything civil about dismantling 26 years in the space between appetizers and the main course. As Drew stepped away, to accept congratulations from the CEO of a rival firm, I noticed her, Vanessa Reid. 15 years younger than me, glossy dark hair cascading over bare shoulders. His former lab assistant, now suddenly the director of clinical partnerships. The way she looked at him answered the question I hadn't yet asked. The divorce papers arrived via courier on Tuesday morning, delivered to the Queen Anne craftsman home where I'd cultivated an award-winning garden and raised our daughter, Emma. The home Drew now informed me I would need to vacate within 30 days. I sat at our kitchen island, or rather, his kitchen island according to the settlement proposal, staring at the document's clinical language. Equitable distribution that somehow left Drew with the house, the vacation property in San Juan Islands, his company shares, and his pension. I would receive a generous cash settlement that might afford me a small apartment and basic living expenses. After all, I hadn't worked formally since leaving my research position to support Drew's career and raise Emma. What the settlement failed to acknowledge were the countless evenings spent at this very counter, sketching molecular structures and talking through research problems Drew brought home. My PhD in biochemistry hadn't vanished when I'd stepped back from the lab. It had simply been redirected toward advancing my husband's work rather than my own. 26 years of intellectual partnership reduced to a cash payout that represented pennies compared to what he, had built with my help. The doorbell rang, interrupting my stunned contemplation of how thoroughly Drew had planned his exit. When I opened the door, I found Emma standing there, her expression suggesting she already knew. "Dad called," she said, stepping inside and setting her briefcase on the entryway table. "Are you okay?" Our daughter had always been direct. At 28, Emma had established herself as a rising star in intellectual property law, a career path inspired by dinner table conversations about patent protection for her father's research. I gestured toward the papers spread across the kitchen island. "Your father has been very thorough." Emma scanned the document with a professional efficiency that made my heart ache. When had my little girl become this poised, polished attorney? "This is insulting," she said finally, her jaw tightening in a way that reminded me of myself in younger days. "And potentially fraudulent." "What do you mean?" "Mom, you helped develop the molecular structure for neuroflexin. I remember the notebooks, the discussions. You essentially co-invented a drug that's now worth billions without formal credit." I shook my head. "I was just helping your father think through problems. It was his work." Emma pulled out her phone. "I'm calling Jason. He specializes in scientific intellectual property disputes at my firm." "Emma, please, I don't want to." Drag this out or make it ugly. Her fingers paused over the screen. Making it fair isn't making it ugly, Mom. And this, she tapped the settlement papers, this is nowhere close to fair. 3 hours later, Emma's colleague Jason Chen sat at our dining room table, surrounded by papers, his expression growing increasingly animated as Emma and I walked him through the history of my collaboration with Drew. Mrs. Mitchell, Becca, please. Becca, Jason corrected with a polite smile. Would you happen to have any of your original notes or drawings? Anything that documents your contributions to neuroflexin or other compounds? A flush of embarrassment warmed my cheeks. I never kept formal records. It was just marriage. We talked. I sketched ideas. Emma interjected. Mom has a photographic memory for molecular structures. She'd draw them on napkins, in the margins of books. Dad used to joke that her mind was the best research tool he had. Jason's expression brightened. That's actually helpful to establish a pattern. What about emails? Text messages where you discussed work? I thought for a moment. Drew usually kept work discussions face-to-face, confidentiality concerns, but there might be some emails where I sent him sketches or thoughts. And what about your prenuptial agreement? Jason asked, glancing around at the spread of documents. Emma and I exchanged looks. There is one, I said. From before we married. Standard protection for inheritance, I think. It's somewhere in the safe. We should review it, Jason suggested. Sometimes these older documents contain language that could be relevant, especially regarding intellectual property created during the marriage. I moved to Drew's home office, a space I rarely entered out of respect for his privacy, and opened the wall safe using the combination I'd memorized years ago but seldom needed. Inside, among insurance policies and property deeds, I found the prenuptial agreement we'd signed 27 years earlier, when Drew was a promising researcher and I was finishing my PhD. The document was thinner than I remembered, yellowed, slightly with age. I returned to the dining room and handed it to Jason, who began to read with the focused attention of someone mining for gold. 10 minutes passed in silence before a smile broke across Jason's face. Mrs. Mitchell, Becca, have you ever read page 7 of your prenuptial agreement? I shook my head. Not since we signed it. Drew's father insisted on the prenup. We were young, in love. I just signed where the lawyer indicated. Jason turned the document around and pointed to a paragraph midway down the page. In the event of dissolution of marriage, he read aloud, any intellectual property, including but not limited to scientific research, patents, formulations, and creative works, developed with the substantive intellectual contribution of both parties shall be considered joint property, regardless of formal attribution or registration. Such contributions shall be valued at market standards for comparable professional consultation in the relevant field. The room seemed to tilt slightly as the implications sank in. This means, Emma said, her voice vibrating with something between shock and triumph, that if you contributed intellectually to Dad's research, which we know you did, you're entitled to fair compensation as a consultant would be. Not just for neuroflexin, but for everything you helped with. Jason nodded, already making notes. This is unusually specific language for a prenup from that era. It's almost as though someone anticipated exactly this situation. Drew's father, I said quietly, memories surfacing. Richard was always worried that Drew would take advantage of people's ideas without proper credit. He'd seen it happen in his own career. So he protected you, Emma concluded. And Drew probably never read the details, Jason added. Most people don't revisit their prenups unless they have to. For the first time since receiving the divorce papers, I felt something other than shock and betrayal. A small flame of righteous anger began to burn. What do we do now? I asked. Emma and Jason exchanged looks that communicated professional assessment. First, we need to document your contributions, Jason said. Then, We file a response to his settlement offer that invokes the prenuptial agreement's intellectual property clause. The timing is actually perfect because his company just publicly valued Neuroflexin at the gala. And we need to move quickly, Emma added, before any company records mysteriously disappear. That night, after Emma and Jason left with copies of everything relevant, I sat alone in the garden I'd lovingly tended for decades. Twilight softened the edges of the Seattle skyline visible from our hillside home, soon to be Drew's home alone, according to his plans. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My phone buzzed with a text message from Drew. I hope you've had time to review the settlement. My lawyer thinks it's more than generous given the circumstances. Let's not make this difficult. The polite condescension in those words crystallized something inside me. For 26 years, I'd shaved the edges off myself to fit into the shape of supportive wife. I'd transferred my scientific brilliance to him freely, considering our partnership a shared enterprise with shared rewards. Now, with one clinical document, Drew had revealed the truth. He'd seen me not as a partner, but as an accessory, easily discarded when convenient. My contributions as disposable as last season's wardrobe. I didn't respond to his text. Instead, I opened my laptop and began a document titled Contributions to Emerald Bay Biotech Research, 1997-2023. Working through the night, I reconstructed conversations, breakthroughs, and specific molecular modifications I'd suggested that had become central to Drew's most profitable patents. My photographic memory for chemical structures, the quirky talent Drew had found so useful, now became my most powerful asset. I recalled with perfect clarity the evening I'd suggested the alternative binding site that solved the neural pathway issue in Neuroflexin. I remembered the weekend at the San Juan house when I'd sketched the modified enzyme that eventually became the cornerstone of their cancer treatment protocol. By dawn, I had filled 43 pages with detailed contributions spanning more than 2 decades. Reading it over, even I was surprised by the extent of what I'd given freely, expecting nothing in return except partnership and respect. I emailed the document to Emma and Jason, then finally slept, not in the master bedroom I'd shared with Drew, but in Emma's old room, surrounded by remnants of the life we'd built that Drew now wanted to erase. The next morning, I awoke to an email notification that Drew had scheduled an emergency board meeting at Emerald Bay Biotech. Emma called moments later. Jason has a contact at the company, she said without preamble. They're discussing a reorganization of research attribution to clarify historical contributions. 3 guesses what that's about. He's trying to erase me completely, I said, surprised by how calm I felt. After a night of reconstructing my contributions, anger had crystallized into determination. Too late, Emma replied. We've already filed notice of potential intellectual property claims based on the prenup clause. Their counsel has been served. 2 days later, I received a text from Drew asking to meet at Harbor Lights, a neutral waterfront cafe where we'd once celebrated anniversaries. The choice was deliberate, a setting with pleasant memories where I might be most amenable to compromise. I arrived early, selecting a table with a clear view of Elliott Bay. Drew appeared precisely on time, impeccably dressed in the casual, expensive style that signaled success without ostentation. Becca, he said, leaning in for the awkward half-hug of estranged couples in public places. You look tired. Reconstructing 26 years of unattributed intellectual contributions will do that, I replied, keeping my voice level. His expression flickered between annoyance and concern before settling into the calm, reasonable mask he wore for difficult negotiations. I think there's been a misunderstanding, he began, signaling for coffee. Emma's young, ambitious. I understand why. She might see this situation through an adversarial lens, but you and I know what our arrangement was. Do we? I took a sip of water, grateful that my hand remained steady. What exactly was our arrangement, Drew? He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. You chose to step back from your career. I supported that choice and provided well for you and Emma. That was the agreement. And my ideas? The molecular structures I designed? The research problems I solved at our kitchen counter? Were those just household contributions? Like doing the laundry or planning dinner parties for your investors? Drew's jaw tightened. We were married. We talked about work. That's normal. What's not normal is building a billion-dollar company on your spouse's unattributed ideas, then discarding them with a settlement that amounts to pocket change compared to what those ideas generated. That's an extreme characterization. Page 7 of our prenup disagrees. The coffee arrived. Drew stirred his absently, his attention clearly focused on recalculating his position. That document is nearly 30 years old, he said finally. It was standard language my father's lawyer inserted. It wouldn't hold up against modern intellectual property frameworks. Maybe not on its own, I agreed. But combined with the documentation of my specific substantial contributions to neuroflexin, cardiotrack, and the enzyme modification for OncoGuard, those patents are worth billions, Drew, and I can prove I helped develop them. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine concern in his eyes. What do you want, Becca? Just tell me what you want so we can resolve this. The question hung between us. What did I want? Revenge would be easy. I could demand a public acknowledgement, force the company to reissue patents with my name included, watch Drew explain to shareholders why their intellectual property holdings were suddenly in jeopardy. But revenge wasn't the hollow space I felt inside when reading those divorce papers. What I wanted was recognition, not just financial compensation, but acknowledgement of my worth as a scientist, a contributor, a mind. Full financial valuation of my contributions based on market rates for consultancy work of similar impact, I said. Retroactive for all products currently generating revenue that I contributed to, and formal credit as co-developer on the neuroflexin patent. Drew's face hardened. That's not reasonable. Your father thought it was reasonable enough to put it in our prenup. You'd damage the company. Stock would plummet if we had to restate intellectual property ownership. I leaned forward. I helped build that company, Drew. Contribution by contribution, insight by insight. I never asked for credit because I thought we were partners. Now I know we weren't. So yes, I'll take what I'm legally entitled to. He stood abruptly. My lawyers will contact yours. This conversation is unproductive. As Drew strode away, I noticed Vanessa waiting near the cafe entrance, pretending to study her phone. The sight of them leaving together, him already moving on while I fought for recognition of my past, should have hurt. Instead, it clarified my resolve. The next week passed in a flurry of legal proceedings. Drew's attorneys filed motions to dismiss my claims, arguing that spousal conversations didn't constitute formal scientific contribution. Our side countered with detailed documentation of specific molecular structures I'd designed that were now central to Emerald Bay's most profitable products. I moved into Emma's spare bedroom, unable to remain in the house that held so many memories of intellectual collaboration now being denied. Each day brought new legal maneuvers from Drew's team, increasingly desperate attempts to minimize or discredit my contributions. Then came the turning point. Jason called one evening, barely containing his excitement. We found Dr. Lawrence Peters, he announced, your former research supervisor. Lawrence? I hadn't heard that name in years. What does he have to do with this? He kept copies of your early research, and he has emails, dozens of them, where Drew consulted him about your work after you left academia. Drew specifically asked about your methodology for protein binding sites. I sank onto Emma's couch. Drew used my graduate research? Not just used it, built on it. According to Dr. Peters, the foundational approach to neuroflexin was derived directly from your doctoral work. Work that predated your marriage. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Not only had Drew used my ongoing input throughout our marriage, but he'd actually built his initial breakthrough on my research from before we were married. Can we prove it? I asked. Dr. Peters has agreed to testify. He's retained comprehensive records. He says he always thought it was strange that you weren't credited, given how closely the early Emerald Bay patents aligned with your doctoral focus. 2 days later, Drew requested another meeting, this time at his attorney's office. I arrived with Emma and Jason, steeled for another round of dismissals and denials. Instead, we found Drew uncharacteristically subdued, flanked by his legal team and 2 board members from Emerald Bay Biotech. The settlement they proposed was more than fair. It was vindicating. Full financial compensation for my contributions at senior consultant rates, co-credit on 3 major patents, including neuroflexin, a seat on the scientific advisory board, if I wanted it, and a public acknowledgement of my role in the company's groundbreaking research. Why the change of heart? I asked Drew directly after the attorneys had outlined the terms. He couldn't quite meet my eyes. The board felt it was in the company's best interest to resolve this quickly. One of the board members, an older woman I'd met at company functions, spoke up. What Mr. Mitchell means is that once we understood the extent of your contributions, continuing to deny them became ethically untenable and potentially devastating to shareholder value. I signed the agreement that afternoon. The divorce proceeded separately, with a far more equitable division of assets than Drew had initially proposed. 3 months later, I stood at the podium of the same hotel ballroom where Drew had informed me of his divorce plans. The audience was smaller, a scientific symposium rather than a gala, but more meaningful. Researchers, academics, former colleagues who had reached out after news of my settlement with Emerald Bay became public. The molecular pathway I'll be discussing today represents a new approach to neuroplasticity, I began, advancing to the first slide that displayed a complex structure I'd developed in the small lab space I'd established with my settlement funds. From the back of the room, Emma gave me an encouraging nod. Beside her sat Lawrence Peters, my former advisor whose records had proven instrumental in establishing my intellectual contribution. Drew was not present. Our personal relationship remained severed, though we maintained a distant professional connection through the company. Vanessa, I'd heard, had been reassigned to a different division after questions arose about her sudden promotion trajectory. As I walked the audience through my research, my name prominently displayed on the presentation, I felt the hollow space inside me filling with something new. Not the partnership I'd thought I had with Drew, but something perhaps more valuable. Recognition of my own mind, independent of anyone else's validation. The presentation concluded to enthusiastic applause. As attendees approached with questions and comments, I caught sight of a young female researcher hanging back, clearly wanting to speak but hesitant. Your approach to the binding site issue is brilliant, she said when I finally made my way to her. I'm working on something similar but couldn't resolve the stability problem. We fell into a deep technical discussion. I found myself sketching a modified structure on the back of her program, the familiar joy of scientific problem-solving flowing through me. You should publish this, she said, looking at the sketch with wide eyes. Maybe we both should, I replied. Collaborative research can be incredibly powerful when properly acknowledged. Later that evening, I returned to my new apartment in Capitol Hill, smaller than the Queen Anne house but filled with books, research materials, and a sense of possibility that had been missing for years. On my desk sat a framed copy of page 7 from that decades-old prenuptial agreement, the overlooked clause that had forced recognition of my intellectual worth. I ran my fingers over the glass, tracing words that Richard Mitchell had insisted on including, perhaps seeing in his son the same tendency that had eventually manifested. Don't overlook the fine print, the frame seemed to say, especially when it contains your true value. My phone chimed with a message from the young researcher I'd met earlier, sharing her preliminary data and suggesting a collaboration. Another notification showed an invitation to speak at an international conference. A third was from a pharmaceutical startup seeking consultation on a challenging molecular design problem. After 26 years of pouring my intelligence into someone else's success, I was finally claiming the recognition I deserved. Not as someone's wife or support system, but as a scientist in my own right. The path ahead was uncertain, but entirely mine. Each molecule I designed, each problem I solved, now properly attributed to the mind that created them. I opened my laptop and began to type a response to the collaboration request. My name in the signature line standing alone and complete. Rebecca Mitchell, Ph.D., no longer invisible, no longer uncredited, and never again underestimated. The buzzing of my phone jarred me from sleep at 5:47 a.m. Emma's name flashed on the screen, unusual for my typically late-rising daughter. "He's erasing files," she said without preamble. "Jason's contact at Emerald Bay just called. Drew ordered IT to reorganize the research archives first thing this morning." I sat up, sleep evaporating instantly. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means," Emma replied, her voice tight with controlled anger, "that your soon-to-be ex-husband is systematically removing evidence of your contributions before we can legally request access." A familiar hollowness formed in my stomach, the same sensation I'd felt when Drew announced our divorce at the gala. Can he do that? It's technically spoliation of evidence, but only if we can prove he destroyed specific documents after receiving notice of litigation, which is why Jason is filing for an emergency preservation order right now. I'm coming to pick you up in 20 minutes. I moved through Emma's apartment on autopilot, dressing in clothes I'd hastily packed when leaving the Queen Anne house. The surreality of my situation struck me anew. How quickly one could transition from established life to displacement, from partnership to adversary. Emma arrived with coffee and a determined expression that reminded me of myself at her age, before decades of accommodation had smoothed my edges. "We need to talk to Lawrence Peters today," she said as we navigated morning traffic toward downtown. Jason tracked him to UW Medical Center. He's doing cardiovascular research there. "I haven't spoken to Lawrence in over 20 years, I said, anxiety fluttering in my chest. My former research advisor had been disappointed when I abandoned my promising career to support Drew's. Would he even remember me, let alone help? "Well, he remembers you. When Jason mentioned your name, Dr. Peters immediately asked if this was about Drew Mitchell finally getting caught." The law firm of Wallace & Patel occupied 3 floors of a sleek downtown tower with views of Puget Sound. Jason met us in a conference room already cluttered with documents and open laptops. "Judge Watkins granted our preservation order," he announced, sliding a document across the table. "Emerald Bay must maintain all records related to research development for the specified compounds. Their counsel has been notified." "Is it too late?" I asked, thinking of Drew's early morning directive. Jason smiled. "Fortunately, modern corporate systems create automatic backups. And even more fortunately, the company's head of IT happens to dislike your husband intensely." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Personal animosity as legal strategy. Interesting approach." "I prefer to think of it as leveraging human nature," Jason replied, turning to his laptop. "Now we've mapped your documented contributions against Emerald Bay's patent portfolio. The overlap is substantial." He displayed a chart showing a timeline of the company's major drug developments, highlighting areas where my recollections of contributions aligned with significant breakthroughs. "Neuroflexin is our strongest case," he continued. "Your description of modifying the binding site mechanism matches exactly with the patented approach. But we need more than your recollection." "Which is why we're meeting Dr. Peters," Emma finished. Lawrence Peters had aged considerably since I'd last seen him, hair now silver, face creased by years of academic struggles and triumphs. But his Eyes remained sharp as they assessed me across his cluttered university office. "Rebecca," he said, using my full name as he always had, even when we'd worked closely. 23 years since you walked away from a brilliant career to become Drew Mitchell's supporting cast. I winced at the bluntness. It wasn't quite that simple, Lawrence. Wasn't it? He gestured to filing cabinets lining his office walls. I keep copies of all my doctoral students' work, organized chronologically. Shall we look at yours? For the next hour, Lawrence methodically pulled files documenting my doctoral research on neurological binding sites, research that predated my marriage to Drew by 3 years. Your approach was innovative, Lawrence noted, spreading papers across his desk, using modified receptor configurations to enhance neural pathway transmission. Sound familiar? Too familiar. It was essentially the foundation of neuroflexin, Emerald Bay's blockbuster drug. Drew knew about this research, I said slowly. He attended my dissertation defense. Lawrence nodded, pulling out a folder labeled Mitchell Correspondence. Drew contacted me multiple times after you left academia, asking about your methodology, your experimental design. Said he was helping you maintain professional connections. Lawrence's voice dripped with disdain. I thought you two were collaborating. He handed Emma a stack of printed emails, dozens of exchanges between Lawrence and Drew, spanning years after I'd supposedly stepped away from scientific work. May I ask why you kept these? Jason inquired. Lawrence's expression hardened. Because something felt wrong. Drew asked questions only someone developing similar research would ask. Yet Rebecca's name never appeared on any papers or patents. I've been in academia long enough to recognize intellectual appropriation when I see it. Why didn't you say anything? I asked, emotions swirling between gratitude for his foresight and frustration at his silence. To whom? You seemed content with your choices. Drew was becoming increasingly prominent. And without your explicit complaint, he shrugged. But I kept the records, just in case. Emma examined the emails with professional intensity. These established that Drew was specifically targeting Mom's research methodology as early as 1998. Combined with the prenup clause and Mom's documented contributions, we have a compelling case. Lawrence turned to me, his expression softening slightly. Your insights deserved recognition, Rebecca. They always did. As we left the medical center, the reality of my situation crystallized with new clarity. Drew hadn't merely used my ongoing help throughout our marriage. He had systematically built his early career on my foundational research, creating a pattern of appropriation that spanned decades. What now? I asked Emma as we walked toward the parking garage. Now, she said with grim satisfaction, we depose your husband. Drew's deposition was scheduled for the following week at Wallace & Patel. I spent the intervening days reconstructing more of my contributions with renewed confidence, my memory for molecular structures proving invaluable as I documented dozens of specific instances where my ideas had become Emerald Bay products. The morning of the deposition, Emma found me, staring out her apartment window, anxiety twisting my stomach. Having second thoughts? She asked, setting a cup of tea beside me. Not about pursuing what's mine, I clarified, but about facing Drew. 26 years is a long time to realize you've been used rather than valued. Emma sat beside me. You know what I remember from growing up? How Dad would come home frustrated, with some research problem, and you two would talk at the kitchen counter for hours. The way he'd look at you when you suggested something that worked, like you were magic. He needed my mind, I said quietly. Just not enough to credit it. I think he needed you in ways he can't admit to himself. And now he's going to pay for that self-deception. Emma squeezed my hand. Ready to watch him squirm? The conference room felt charged with tension when Drew arrived with his legal team, 3 attorneys from Seattle's most prestigious corporate law firm. His expression remained neutral when he saw me, though his eyes widened slightly at the volume of documentation spread across our side of the table. Jason conducted the initial questioning, establishing Drew's position at Emerald Bay Biotech and the development timeline of their major products. Drew answered with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to investor presentations and board meetings. "Dr. Mitchell," Jason said, emphasizing the title, "could you explain the development process for neuroflexin, specifically the innovation in the binding site mechanism?" Drew launched into a technical explanation that was both accurate and carefully self-attributing. According to his version, the breakthrough had come during an intensive research period in 1999. "And where did the initial concept for modifying the receptor configuration come from?" Jason asked. "It was an extension of existing research in the field," Drew replied smoothly, "built on established principles of neurochemistry." Jason nodded pleasantly, then placed a document on the table. "I'd like to enter as Exhibit 14 Rebecca Mitchell's doctoral dissertation from 1995, specifically pages 117 through 132, where she proposes modifying receptor configurations in precisely the manner later used in neuroflexin." Drew's attorney leaned forward. "The development of pharmaceutical compounds is complex and builds on multiple research sources." "I'm not finished," Jason interrupted politely. "I'd also like to enter as Exhibit 15 correspondence between Dr. Drew Mitchell and Dr. Lawrence Peters, specifically inquiring about Rebecca Mitchell's research methodology between 1998 and 2001, immediately preceding Emerald Bay's patent application for neuroflexin." Color drained from Drew's face as Jason methodically laid out email after email, messages Drew had thought long deleted or forgotten. "Would you like to revise your statement about the origins of the binding site innovation?" Jason asked. Drew conferred quietly with his attorneys before responding. "Rebecca and I often discussed scientific concepts. As married researchers, it's natural that ideas would flow between us." Yet Rebecca Mitchell received no formal credit on the patents, publications, or company documentation, despite the fact that Jason placed another document on the table. "Your prenuptial agreement specifically addresses intellectual property created with substantive contribution of both parties." Drew's lead attorney called for a break. As they huddled in the corner of the room, I observed my husband of 26 years. His confident facade had cracked, revealing glimpses of calculation behind his eyes, the same expression he wore when strategizing for challenging board meetings. When questioning resumed, Jason methodically walked through each of my major contributions, supporting each with documentation, timelines, and in some cases, testimony from former Emerald Bay researchers who remembered my consulting input on critical problems. By mid-afternoon, Drew's attorneys requested a temporary adjournment. "Our client would like to discuss potential resolution options," the lead counsel stated carefully. As they filed out, Drew lingered, approaching our table with measured steps. "Becca," he said quietly, "this doesn't have to become destructive. We can find a reasonable compromise." "Like the generous settlement you initially offered?" I replied, keeping my voice steady. "The one that valued 26 years of intellectual contribution at roughly the price of a studio apartment?" A flicker of the old Drew, the man I'd fallen in love with decades ago, appeared in his expression. "I never meant to get caught," I finished, "or to have to acknowledge where your breakthroughs really came from." Emma stepped between us. "Any further communication should go through counsel." Later that evening, Drew's attorneys contacted Wallace and Patel with an initial settlement offer, significantly higher than the original proposal, but still far below the value of my contributions. "It's a starting point," Jason noted as we reviewed the terms. "They know they're vulnerable, but they're hoping to minimize the damage. They're especially concerned about the public relations aspect," Emma added. "A large pharmaceutical company built on appropriated female intellectual labor isn't exactly a winning narrative." I studied the offer, thinking not of the financial terms, but of the careful language that avoided any admission of my scientific contribution. Even now, Drew was attempting to erase my mind from the equation. Counter with full credit as co-developer on neuroflexin and consulting credit on the eye. Other compounds, I said decisively, and value my contribution at senior research scientist rates for the entire period. Emma looked surprised. That's substantially more than they've offered. It's substantially less than I'm worth, I replied. But I want this resolved. And I want my name on that patent. 3 days of intense negotiation followed. Drew's team resisted the co-developer credit most fiercely, offering increasingly large financial settlements to avoid formal attribution. Their persistence only strengthened my resolve. The money mattered less than the recognition of my intellectual contribution. On the 4th day, Drew requested a private meeting, just the two of us, outside legal channels. Against Emma's advice, I agreed to meet him at the university botanical garden, where we'd often walked during our early years together. Spring flowers had begun to emerge along the winding paths. Drew waited on a bench near the medicinal plants section, looking older than I remembered, the weight of recent events visible in the slump of his shoulders. "Thank you for coming," he said as I sat beside him, maintaining careful distance. "What do you want, Drew? Our attorneys are handling the negotiations." He gazed at a cluster of flowering herbs, plants whose chemical compositions we'd once discussed for potential pharmaceutical applications. "Do you remember when we met? Your presentation on neurotransmitter pathways at that conference in Chicago?" I remembered perfectly. The nervous young researcher presenting my findings, Drew's incisive questions afterward, our conversation extending through dinner and into the next day. "You dazzled me," he continued when I didn't respond. "Not just with your brilliance, but with how you saw connections no one else did. It's why I fell in love with you." "And why you built a career on my insights without credit," I added quietly. Drew winced. "I never thought of it that way. We were a team, partners." "Partners share recognition, Drew. They don't file sole patents on their partners' ideas." Silence stretched between us, filled only by the distant voices of garden visitors. "I can't give you co-developer credit," he finally said. "The board would never approve it. It would raise too many questions about other patents, about the company's intellectual property foundation." "Then we continue with litigation," I replied, standing to leave. "And all those questions get asked in public record." Drew reached for my arm. "The company is in acquisition talks. Medcore Global is preparing an offer that would value Emerald Bay at over $4 billion. If authorship issues emerge now..." Understanding dawned. "This isn't about protecting your reputation. It's about protecting the acquisition. It's about protecting thousands of jobs, Becca. Research that helps millions of patients. All of that could be jeopardized if Medcore pulls out." For a moment, I felt the familiar pull to prioritize others' needs above my own recognition, the pattern of our entire marriage. Then I remembered the hollow feeling when reading those divorce papers, the casual erasure of my contribution. "You should have thought about those consequences before serving me divorce papers and a settlement that valued me at less than your vacation home," I said, pulling my arm from his grasp. "My terms haven't changed." The next morning, Jason called with news. "They've made a new offer, full financial compensation at senior researcher rates, consulting credit on secondary patents." He paused. "And co-developer credit on neuroflexin." "Why the sudden change?" Emma asked, her suspicion evident. "Apparently there's an acquisition deal in progress, Medcore Global. Our claims could derail it, so they're motivated to resolve quickly and quietly." I thought of Drew's desperate plea in the garden, the jobs and research he claimed would be jeopardized. "Are there conditions attached to the neuroflexin credit?" "A non-disclosure agreement regarding the settlement terms and a statement that the attribution clarification is the result of administrative oversight correction," Jason read from the document. "Basically, you get the credit without anyone admitting wrongdoing." That's standard corporate face saving, Emma noted. The important thing is you get the recognition. I considered the offer, weighing justice against pragmatism. I want one. Addition. A research fund established in my name at the university. For female biochemistry students. 2 weeks later, I sat in another sleek conference room, signing the final settlement documents. The terms exceeded anything I might have imagined when first receiving those divorce papers. Substantial financial compensation, formal credit on multiple patents, and the establishment of the Rebecca Mitchell Fellowship for Women in Biochemical Research. Drew was not present for the signing, having sent his chief counsel instead. The acquisition talks with Medcore Global proceeded without disruption, though I noted with satisfaction that my name now appeared in the intellectual property disclosures Medcore would be reviewing. The divorce itself finalized with much less drama than the intellectual property battle. With my financial position secured through the settlement, I had no need to fight over the house or other assets. Drew could keep the Queen Anne craftsman with its carefully tended garden. I was cultivating something else entirely. 3 months after signing the settlement, I received an invitation to speak at the Northwest Biochemical Innovation Conference, AA, prestigious gathering I'd attended many times as Drew's wife, but never as a presenter. The topic: receptor modification approaches in neurological treatments. The irony wasn't lost on me. After decades of having my ideas appropriated, I was now being asked to present them under my own name. The conference center buzzed with activity as I navigated to the speaker preparation room. Several researchers nodded in recognition as I passed, no longer viewing me as merely Drew Mitchell's wife, but as a colleague with valuable insights. "Dr. Mitchell?" a voice called from behind me. I turned to find a young woman holding a copy of the recently revised Neuroflexin patent, the one now bearing my name alongside Drew's. "I'm Dr. Sophia Kwan. I've been studying your approach to receptor modification and had some questions about potential applications in treatment-resistant depression." For the next 20 minutes, we engaged in the kind of intensive scientific dialogue I'd missed desperately, two minds exploring possibilities without concern for attribution or politics. Sophia's questions were insightful, her approach innovative. "You should consider developing this further," I encouraged as our conversation concluded. "It has significant potential." Sophia hesitated. "Actually, I've applied for a grant to pursue the research, but funding is scarce for unproven approaches." An idea formed. "Have you heard of the Mitchell Fellowship?" My presentation later that day filled a room designed to hold 200. With nearly 300 attendees, some standing along the walls, as I discussed the neurological binding site innovations that had transformed treatment approaches, I felt a sensation I hadn't experienced in decades. The pure satisfaction of being recognized for my own intellect. In the front row sat Emma, beaming with pride. Beside her, surprisingly, was Lawrence Peters, my former advisor whose meticulous record-keeping had proven so crucial. And in the back, partially obscured by a column but unmistakable, stood Drew, watching with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. The question session afterward ran long, researchers eager to explore aspects of the work that had previously been attributed solely to Drew or Emerald Bay's research team. I answered with growing confidence, reclaiming ownership of ideas I'd freely given away throughout my marriage. As the room finally cleared, Drew approached the podium, maintaining a respectful distance. "Impressive presentation," he said, echoing words he'd used countless times after his own speeches. "The longitudinal applications you suggested have significant potential." "I know," I replied simply. "I've been developing them for years." An uncomfortable silence stretched between us, bridging decades of unacknowledged contributions. "The acquisition closes next week," he said finally. "Medcore is retaining most of the research division. Congratulations. They've asked about you, whether you might consider a consulting position." I raised an eyebrow. "Have they? Or have you suggested it? Drew shifted slightly. Does it matter? Your insights are valuable. They should be utilized. For a moment, I glimpsed the man I'd married, the scientist who genuinely valued my mind, before ambition and ego had overshadowed partnership. But that glimpse wasn't enough to erase 26 years of unattributed contributions. I've received several consulting offers, I said neutrally. I'm considering my options. Becca, he hesitated. I know things between us can't be repaired, but I am sorry. Not just for the legal battle, but for not seeing what should have been obvious. Your brilliance deserved acknowledgement. The apology, however belated, loosened something tight within my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of resolution. Thank you for coming today, I said, gathering my presentation materials. It means something that you heard me present under my own name. 2 days later, I signed a lease on a small commercial space near the university, a converted warehouse with high ceilings and natural light. Using a portion of my settlement funds, I established Mitchell Biochemical Consulting, offering specialized expertise in neurological and oncological applications. My first client was Sophia Kwan, the recent recipient of the inaugural Mitchell Fellowship. The second was a startup focused on rare neurological disorders, founded by former Emerald Bay researchers who had remembered my unofficial contributions over the years. Emma helped me furnish the office, including a state-of-the-art laboratory section where I could test concepts and demonstrate techniques. I never imagined you as an entrepreneur, she commented as we arranged research journals on built-in shelving. Always thought you were the behind-the-scenes type. I was, I replied, positioning my newly framed degrees and patents on the wall. Until someone tried to keep me there permanently. The space quickly became more than just an office. Female biochemistry students from the university began stopping by, seeking advice or mentorship. Several brought research problems, creating the kind of vibrant intellectual environment I'd missed since leaving academia. 6 months after the settlement, the Mitchell Fellowship announced its first major research breakthrough. Sophia Kwan's modified approach to neurotransmitter pathways showed promising results in treatment-resistant depression cases. The university press release prominently mentioned both Sophia's innovation and the fellowship that had made it possible. Drew sent a brief email of congratulation. Medcore Global, now the parent company of what had been Emerald Bay Biotech, followed with an offer to fund expanded clinical trials. I negotiated terms that ensured Sophia would maintain principal researcher credit regardless of outcomes. On the 1-year anniversary of that fateful gala where Drew had announced our divorce, I received a formal invitation to the annual Biotech Innovation Awards. This time, not as someone's wife, but as a nominee for the Emerging Influence Award, a recognition of researchers whose work demonstrated significant potential impact. The irony of being nominated as an emerging influence after 30 years in the field wasn't lost on me. But the nomination recognized my recent independent work, not my contributions through Drew, and that distinction mattered. The Grand Pacific. Hotel ballroom looked much the same as it had a year earlier, elegantly appointed, filled with industry luminaries in formal attire. But my experience of it was fundamentally different. I arrived alone, wearing a deep blue gown selected for comfort rather than to complement someone else's tuxedo. Colleagues greeted me as I navigated to my assigned table. Former Emerald Bay researchers, now Medcore employees, stopped to discuss recent developments. A young woman introduced herself as a second-year Mitchell Fellow, her enthusiasm for research infectious. Drew arrived midway through the cocktail hour, accompanied by Medcore executives rather than Vanessa. Our eyes met briefly across the room, a moment of recognition without rancor. He nodded slightly. I returned the gesture. The simple exchange felt like the closing of a chapter. When the Emerging Influence Award was announced, I heard my name. With a surge of validation that had nothing to do with my former marriage, and everything to do with my recent work on modified receptor approaches for treatment-resistant conditions. Standing at the podium, award in hand, I surveyed the room filled with people who now recognized me for my mind rather than my marital status. The journey from invisible contributor to acknowledged innovator had been painful, but necessary. This recognition is particularly meaningful, I said into the microphone, because it represents work done in my own name, under my own direction. But I want to acknowledge the many women in science whose contributions remain uncredited, whose insights shape innovations attributed to others. From the back of the room, Emma gave me a thumbs up. Beside her sat Jason, who had recently taken on 3 similar cases of unattributed intellectual contribution. True innovation rarely happens in isolation, I continued. It emerges from collaboration, from the free exchange of ideas. But collaboration without attribution isn't partnership, it's appropriation. And we can do better. Afterward, as attendees filtered into the hotel lobby, I found myself face-to-face with Drew for the first time. In months, the awkwardness between us had mellowed into something less raw, less immediate. "Congratulations," he said, glancing at the award I carried. "It's well-deserved." "Thank you." He hesitated, then added, "Your speech about attribution? It was pointed." "It was honest," I corrected gently. "Something we could have used more of over the years." Drew nodded, accepting the implied criticism without defense. "Medcore is implementing more rigorous contribution documentation processes. Your case was instructive." "Good." I gestured toward his Medcore colleagues waiting nearby. "I should let you get back to your group." As I turned to leave, he spoke. "Again. The research fund, your fellowship, it's making a real difference. Thought you should know." The simple acknowledgement meant more than I expected. Not because I needed Drew's validation, but because it represented his recognition of impact created in my name rather than his. "I know," I replied with quiet confidence. That was always the point. Walking away, I felt the weight of our history, both the betrayal and the recent reckoning, settling into proper perspective. The future stretched before me, rich with possibilities I was only beginning to explore. Later that week, I received an email from a pharmaceutical startup specializing in neurological disorders. They were struggling with a binding site issue similar to one I'd solved years earlier. Would I be interested in consulting? I smiled at the familiar problem description, at once old and new. This time, my contribution wouldn't be offered over kitchen counters and forgotten. This time, my name would be on the patents from the beginning. I wrote back a simple response. "I'm available. Let's discuss terms." The terms would include proper attribution. Page 7 had taught me that much. The quarterly board meeting of Mitchell Biochemical Consulting had just concluded when my phone lit up with a notification. Emma's name flashed on the screen alongside a link to Biotech Quarterly's latest issue. The headline made my coffee go cold in my hand. Medcore Global faces challenge to neuroflexin patent. 1 year after my settlement with Drew and Emerald Bay, just as I was finding my footing as an independent consultant, the ground was shifting again. I opened the article to find Drew's carefully composed corporate headshot staring back at me. The piece detailed a challenge from Meridian Pharmaceuticals claiming their research team had developed a similar binding site modification prior to Emerald Bay's patent filing. My name appeared halfway through the article. The patent was recently revised to include Rebecca Mitchell as co-developer, following a settlement between Emerald Bay's founder Drew Mitchell and his former spouse. I set my phone down, letting the implications settle. The intellectual property I'd fought to have recognized was now under threat. If Meridian's challenge succeeded, the value of my hard-won attribution could be significantly diminished. "Bad news?" asked Sophia Kwan, who had transitioned from Mitchell Fellowship recipient to my research partner over the past year. I handed my phone. Sophia scanned the article, her expression growing concerned. This could impact the licensing revenue that funds your fellowship program. She was right. Part of my settlement included ongoing royalties from Neuroflexin, a significant portion of which funded the Mitchell Fellowship. If the patent was invalidated or substantially narrowed, that funding source would disappear. Do you think Drew knew this was coming when he settled? Sophia asked, ever direct. The question had already formed in my mind. Had Drew strategically conceded attribution knowing the patent might soon be challenged? It would be characteristic of his chess player mentality, sacrificing a piece to protect the board. I need to make some calls, I said, gathering my things. Jason Chen sounded unsurprised when I called him from my car. We're already monitoring the situation, he assured me. Meridian's claim looks substantial on paper, but there are significant questions about their timeline. Should I be worried about the settlement terms? I asked, navigating through afternoon traffic toward my Capitol Hill apartment. Your agreement is solid regardless of subsequent patent challenges, Jason replied. But there's something else. You should know, Drew Mitchell reached out to Emma this morning. He's requesting a meeting with you. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. Did he say why? Only that it relates to the Meridian challenge and might be mutually beneficial. After a year of minimal contact, Drew's sudden desire to meet triggered both suspicion and curiosity. What could he possibly want from me now? I'll think about it, I told Jason before ending the call. At home, I pulled up the original research that had led to Neuroflexin's development, my doctoral work on receptor configurations, Drew's early adaptations, our kitchen counter conversations that had solved the binding site stability issue. I knew this molecular pathway better than anyone alive. If there were questions about its development timeline, I was uniquely positioned to address them. But did I want to help Drew and MedCore defend a patent that they'd only reluctantly acknowledged? My contribution too? The thought left a bitter taste. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Dad's being unusually persistent about meeting. Says it's important. Dinner tomorrow? I stared at the message, weighing my options. Professional detachment suggested hearing him out. Self-preservation warned against being drawn back into Drew's orbit. Curiosity won. Fine. Harbor Lights, 7 p.m. Tell him to bring the Meridian filing. Harbor Lights Cafe looked exactly as it had a year earlier when Drew had tried to minimize my settlement claims. The same waterfront view, the same soft lighting, the same background hum of conversations. But I was different. No longer the shocked, displaced wife, but the established founder of Mitchell Biochemical Consulting. Drew arrived precisely on time, impeccably dressed in the business casual style he preferred for serious discussions. He carried a leather portfolio containing what I assumed were the Meridian documents. Becca. He greeted me with a nod, foregoing any attempt at physical contact. Thank you for coming. Let's get to the point, I replied, skipping the pretense of pleasantries. What's this about? Drew sighed, some of his corporate polish falling. Away. Meridian's patent challenge is more serious than the press realizes. Their documentation appears comprehensive. And this concerns me how? Our settlement isn't contingent on the patent's validity. The settlement, no. But the fellowship, funding is tied to ongoing royalties. He placed a thick document on the table. This is Meridian's complete filing. Their claimed timeline overlaps significantly with our early research. I opened the document, scanning the detailed molecular diagrams and development logs. The approach was indeed similar to Neuroflexin's binding mechanism, with subtle but important differences. I see the similarity, I acknowledged, but their stabilization approach differs from what we developed. The efficacy would be compromised in the hippocampal pathway. Drew nodded, the familiar spark of scientific engagement in his eyes. Exactly. But their documentation predates our patent filing by 7 months. I continued examining the molecular diagrams, noticing inconsistencies that triggered my researcher's instincts. These transition states aren't fully resolved. The pathway would degrade under standard conditions. That's what our team concluded as well. Drew leaned forward. Becca, we think their documentation has been reverse engineered. They studied neuroflexin structure and worked backward to create development logs that appear to predate ours. The accusation was serious, intellectual property fraud rather than mere parallel development. Why come to me with this? MedCorp has an army of scientists and lawyers. Drew's expression turned rueful. Because you're the only person alive who understands exactly how we developed the binding site modification. Your recollection of our development process, combined with your current standing as an independent expert, would be persuasive evidence. There it was, the real reason for this meeting. Drew needed me to defend a patent I'd only recently been acknowledged on. So, after fighting to minimize my contribution, you now want me to validate the development timeline. I couldn't keep the irony from my voice. I know how it sounds, Drew admitted. But this isn't just about MedCorp's interests or mine. If Meridian succeeds, it establishes a precedent that could threaten legitimate researchers throughout the FAO industry, including you and your partners. He had a point. Patent fraud through retroactive documentation undermined the entire intellectual property system that protected innovation. I'll review their complete filing, I said finally. But I make no promises about getting involved. Drew nodded, accepting the limited commitment. There's something else you should know. Vanessa Reid is now Meridian's Director of Research Development. The revelation landed like a stone. Vanessa, Drew's former lab assistant and presumed affair partner, now worked for the company challenging our patent. The personal and professional entanglements suddenly took on new complexity. Jason considered the question carefully. You'd need to testify as an expert witness, detailing the actual development process and explaining why their claimed pathway couldn't have produced the results they document. It would put you squarely in opposition to Vanessa Reid. And potentially make me appear to be simply supporting my ex-husband's company, I added. There is that perception risk, Jason acknowledged. But your recent history of challenging Drew over attribution would actually lend credibility to your testimony. If you were willing to fight him for proper credit, why would you now support him unless the facts warranted it? It was a reasonable point. My public battle for recognition established my independence and integrity, perhaps paradoxically making me more credible now as a defender of the patent. What about my settlement? Could getting involved somehow jeopardize that? Jason's shook his head. Your agreement is ironclad regardless of the patent's ultimate status. But practically speaking, the royalty stream funding your fellowship program would be impacted if Meridian succeeds. I stirred my coffee, weighing professional ethics against personal reluctance to re-engage with my past. I need one more piece of information before deciding. That afternoon, I drove to the University of Washington Medical Center to meet Lawrence Peters. My former advisor had become an unexpected ally during my settlement battle with Drew, and his perspective on this new development might prove valuable. Lawrence's office remained exactly as I remembered, cluttered with journals, files, and the accumulated artifacts of a lengthy academic career. He greeted me with his characteristic directness. Rebecca, twice in 2 years after 20 years of silence. I'm beginning to think you only visit when your ex-husband creates problems. I smiled despite myself. Perceptive as always, Lawrence. After explaining the situation with Meridian's patent challenge, I asked the question that had been troubling me. Given Vanessa's role at Meridian, is it possible she had access to original research documents that could have informed their challenge? Lawrence considered the question with academic precision. When did she join Emerald Bay? 2018, I replied. Initially as a lab assistant, then rising quickly through research positions. After the key neuroflexin patents, Lawrence noted. but during the period when derivative applications were being developed. He leaned back in his chair, thinking. She wouldn't have had access to the original development documentation unless Drew specifically shared it with her. Which he might have done, given their relationship, I suggested. Lawrence's eyebrows rose slightly. He hadn't been aware of the personal dimension. In that case, it's entirely possible she had access to original notes that could inform a reconstructed timeline, but not the failed iterations that led to the successful approach. Exactly what my technical analysis had concluded, Meridian's documentation showed the successful path without the critical failed experiments that had guided our actual development process. If I testify against Meridian's claim, it puts me in the position of defending Drew's company, I said, voicing my central conflict. Lawrence fixed me with the stern gaze I remembered from my doctoral days. You wouldn't be defending Drew or his company. You would be defending scientific truth and the integrity of the research process. The fact that it happens to align with Medcor's interests is incidental. Put that way, my path became clearer. The integrity of scientific research transcended personal history. There's something else you should consider, Lawrence added. If Meridian succeeds with fraudulent documentation, it creates a dangerous precedent. Patent protection becomes weakened for all researchers, including your current partners and the young scientists your fellowship supports. His point resonated beyond my personal concerns. This wasn't just about Drew or Vanessa, or even my own credited work. It was about protecting the fundamental systems that made scientific innovation possible. That evening, I called Drew to discuss next steps. His relief at my decision to get involved was palpable even over the phone. Medcor's legal team would like to meet with you tomorrow to prepare for the patent office hearing, he said. I'll meet with them, but on my terms, I replied firmly. I'm not testifying as a Medcor representative or consultant. I'm offering expert testimony as an independent researcher with direct knowledge of the development process. Understood. Drew agreed quickly. The hearing is scheduled for 3 weeks from now in Washington, D.C. I'll need complete access to all original development documentation, I continued, including your personal notes from that period. There was a slight hesitation before Drew responded. Some of those contain proprietary information beyond neuroflexin. I'm not interested in other compounds, but I need to review everything related to our binding site work to prepare thoroughly. After another pause, Drew acquiesced. I'll have everything delivered to your office tomorrow. The following morning, a Medcor courier arrived with sealed boxes containing research journals, laboratory notes, and development documentation spanning the critical period of neuroflexin's creation. These were the original records, some in my handwriting, some in Drew's, that documented our actual process, including the crucial failed approaches that had guided us toward the successful binding mechanism. Sophia helped me organize the materials chronologically, creating a comprehensive timeline of the actual development process. The contrast with Meridian's claimed pathway became increasingly stark as we reconstructed the genuine history. Their documentation is impressively detailed, Sophia observed, comparing Meridian's filing with our reconstructed timeline. But it's like they created a fictional novel based on the ending of a true story. Exactly, I agreed. They knew where we ended up, but not how we got there. The dead ends and failures are missing, and those were what actually led to the breakthrough. As we worked, a notification appeared on my computer, an industry news alert about Meridian Pharmaceuticals. The company had just announced a significant investment round, with capital to be directed toward commercialization of their innovative neurological binding technology. They're raising funds based on the assumption they'll win this patent challenge, Sophia noted. Pretty confident for a company with reconstructed research. Or desperate, I suggested. If they lose, those investors might have questions about due diligence. The pieces were falling into place. Vanessa had left Medcor with insider knowledge of neuroflexin's structure. Meridian had reconstructed a plausible development timeline to challenge the patent. And now they were raising capital based on anticipated success. The stakes extended beyond intellectual property. This was potentially securities fraud if Meridian was misrepresenting the legitimacy of their claim to investors. When Medcor's attorneys arrived later that day, I laid out my analysis and concerns. The lead counsel, Catherine Williams, listened intently as I walked through the technical inconsistencies in Meridian's documentation. "This is extremely helpful," she said when I finished. "Most patent challenges come down to dates on paper. Having someone who can speak to the actual scientific impossibility of their claimed pathway is tremendously valuable." "I'm not doing this for Medcor," I clarified. "I'm doing it because scientific fraud undermines the entire research enterprise." Catherine nodded. "Understood. But your testimony will be most effective if coordinated with our overall strategy." We spent the next several hours preparing for the Patent Office hearing, focusing on the most compelling technical inconsistencies in Meridian's claim. I insisted on maintaining my independence, refusing to be presented as affiliated with Medcor in any way. "I'll testify to what I know firsthand," I told Catherine. "Nothing more, nothing less." As the hearing date approached, I immersed myself in preparation, reviewing original documentation, preparing visual aids to explain complex molecular interactions to non-specialists, and refining my testimony to focus on the scientific impossibility of Meridian's claimed development path. 3 days before we were scheduled to fly to Washington, Drew requested another meeting. This time he suggested my office rather than a neutral location, a tacit acknowledgement that we were meeting on my territory, professionally and literally. "There's been a development," he said without preamble when he arrived. "Vanessa contacted me yesterday." My attention sharpened. What did she want? "To discuss a potential resolution to the patent dispute." His expression was grim. "She suggested that if Medcor were to offer Meridian a favorable licensing arrangement for Neuroflexin, they might reconsider their challenge." "That sounds like extortion based on fraudulent claims," I observed. Drew nodded. "Essentially, but it confirms that they know their challenge won't withstand rigorous examination." "Did you record the conversation?" I asked, thinking like a litigator after months of working with Jason and Emma. "No, but I have the email where she requested the meeting. It's carefully worded but implies the same offer." He hesitated. "There's something else. During the conversation, she mentioned knowing about kitchen counter innovations that weren't in the official documentation." The phrase sent a chill through me. Kitchen counter innovations was exactly how Drew and I had referred to our evening. Discussions of research problems, discussions that had led to many of Neuroflexin's critical breakthroughs. "She could only know that phrase from you," I said, the implication clear. Drew didn't deny it. "We were in a relationship. I talked about work, about the development process, about my contributions," I added, the old hurt briefly resurfacing. "The ones you fought to avoid crediting until forced by that prenup clause." He at least had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Yes, I mentioned your role in those early discussions." The irony was almost too perfect. Drew's reluctance to properly credit my contributions had led to our settlement battle. Now, the woman he had presumably left me for was using knowledge of those same unattributed contributions to challenge the patent I'd fought to be included on. "Does Catherine know about this conversation with Vanessa?" I asked, referring to Medcor's lead counsel. "Not yet. I wanted to discuss it with you first." Another surprising acknowledgement of my position in this situation. Drew was now coming to me as an equal, seeking guidance rather than dictating terms. "She needs to know immediately," I said. "This could be crucial to the Patent Office's understanding of Meridian's motivation and methods." Drew nodded. "I'll call her now." As he stepped away to make the call, I considered how profoundly our dynamic had shifted. A year ago, we'd sat across from each other as adversaries in a bitter dispute. Over attribution? Now we were reluctant allies against a common threat, not because of lingering personal connection, but because of shared commitment to scientific integrity. The Washington, D.C. Patent Office hearing room felt cavernous and intimidating. A wood-paneled chamber with formal proceedings more reminiscent of a courtroom than a scientific conference. Representatives from MedCorp filled one side of the room, Meridian's team the other, with patent office officials at the front. I sat apart from both corporate teams, my position as an independent expert witness physically represented in the seating arrangement. Emma had flown in to provide moral support, sitting just behind me with a reassuring presence. The proceedings began with technical presentations from both sides. Meridian's counsel presented their claimed development timeline, complete with molecular diagrams and laboratory documentation that appeared comprehensive to the untrained eye. Then Catherine Williams presented MedCorp's defense, focusing on the legitimate neuroflexin development history and introducing me as Dr. Rebecca Mitchell, co-developer of the binding site mechanism at issue. When I took the stand, I felt a familiar calm settle over me, the same focused clarity I experienced when solving complex molecular problems or presenting research findings. This was my element, explaining science with precision and insight. Dr. Mitchell, Catherine began, could you explain your role in the development of neuroflexin's binding site mechanism? I co-developed the core molecular innovation while working with Drew Mitchell during the late 1990s and early 2000s, I explained. My contribution was formally recognized last year, adding me as co-developer on the patent. And what is your assessment of Meridian Pharmaceuticals' claim to have independently developed a similar binding mechanism prior to your work with Dr. Mitchell? I directed the patent official's attention to the molecular diagrams displayed on screens around the room. Meridian's claimed development pathway is scientifically implausible. While their final structure resembles neuroflexin's binding mechanism, their documented process skips critical failure points that were essential to our actual discovery process. For the next hour, I methodically walked through the technical inconsistencies in Meridian's documentation, explaining in accessible terms why their claimed pathway couldn't have produced the results they documented. I highlighted specific molecular transitions that would have been unstable under their described conditions and identified key research steps that were conspicuously absent from their timeline. In my professional opinion, I concluded, Meridian's documentation represents a reconstruction based on knowledge of the final neuroflexin structure, not an independent development pathway. The documentation omits necessary experimental failures that guided our actual discovery process. Failures that would have been unavoidable for anyone genuinely developing this binding mechanism from first principles. Meridian's counsel attempted to challenge my testimony during cross-examination, questioning my objectivity given my recent legal battle with Drew Mitchell and MedCorp. Dr. Mitchell, isn't it true that you were involved in contentious litigation with your ex-husband over credit for this very patent last year? The attorney asked. That's correct, I acknowledged calmly. I fought for proper recognition of my intellectual contribution to neuroflexin and other compounds. And now you're supporting his company's position in this dispute. Doesn't that suggest a certain flexibility in your positions? I met his gaze steadily. On the contrary, it demonstrates my commitment to scientific accuracy above personal considerations. I was willing to challenge Drew Mitchell when he failed to credit my work appropriately, and I'm equally willing to defend the legitimate development history of neuroflexin against inaccurate claims, regardless of who benefits. The attorney shifted approaches. How can you be certain of development events that occurred more than 20 years ago? Isn't memory notoriously unreliable? I'm not testifying based solely on memory, I replied. I've reviewed the original laboratory documentation, which confirms the development pathway I've described. Additionally, my specialized expertise allows me to identify technical inconsistencies in Meridian's claimed process that wouldn't be apparent to non-specialists. As the cross-examination continued, I noticed Vanessa Reid sitting behind Meridian's legal team, her expression increasingly troubled. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw something unexpected. Not hostility or defiance, but a flash of what appeared to be shame. The hearing's decisive moment came when Medcor's counsel introduced Drew's documented conversation with Vanessa, in which she had proposed resolving the patent dispute through a licensing arrangement rather than continued litigation. This communication strongly suggests Meridian recognizes the weakness of their position, Catherine argued. Rather than risk having their documentation fully examined, they attempted to leverage the threat of continued litigation into a commercial advantage. The patent office officials conferred briefly before the chief examiner addressed the room. We will require additional technical documentation from Meridian Pharmaceuticals, specifically addressing the experimental failures and transition states identified by Dr. Rebecca Mitchell. Until such documentation is provided, the patent challenge is suspended. It was as close to a victory as possible at this stage. The burden had shifted to Meridian to prove their claimed development pathway was scientifically plausible. A burden I knew they couldn't meet because their documentation was reconstructed, not genuine. As the hearing concluded, I gathered my materials, feeling a complex mixture of professional satisfaction and emotional exhaustion. Emma joined me, squeezing my arm supportively. "You were brilliant," she said. "Absolutely clear and unassailable." Drew approached cautiously, maintaining a respectful distance. "Thank you," he said simply. "Your testimony was decisive." I nodded, accepting the acknowledgement without elaboration. Our shared victory in defending scientific truth didn't erase the past, but it did perhaps offer a glimpse of a more honest future, one where intellectual contributions were properly recognized from the beginning. As we exited the hearing room, I was surprised to find Vanessa waiting in the corridor, separate from the Meridian team. "Dr. Mitchell," she said, addressing me formally, "may I speak with you privately?" Emma looked alarmed, but I nodded reassuringly. "It's fine. I'll meet you at the hotel." When we were alone, Vanessa's carefully maintained professional facade cracked slightly. "I want you to know I didn't initiate the patent challenge," she said, her voice low. "When I joined Meridian, they were already interested in neurological binding technologies. When they learned about my background with Emerald Bay, they saw an opportunity," I finished for her. She nodded. "They asked for my insights into the development process. I shared what I knew, what Drew had told me about the research history. I didn't realize they would use that information to construct a fraudulent timeline." I studied her carefully, trying to determine if this was genuine regret or simply damage. Control now that Meridian's position had weakened. "When did you realize what they were doing?" I asked. "When they produced development documentation for periods before I joined Emerald Bay," she admitted. "Documentation that described processes in terms Drew had used when explaining the history to me, including phrases about kitchen counter innovations. The confirmation of my suspicion brought a strange sense of closure. Drew had shared the story of our collaborative work with Vanessa, perhaps not anticipating how that information might eventually be weaponized. "What will you do now?" I asked. Vanessa straightened, professional resolve returning. "I've already tendered my resignation at Meridian, effective immediately. What they've done crosses ethical lines I'm not willing to be associated with." "And Drew?" I couldn't help asking, curious about the personal dimension that had become entangled with professional ethics. A sad smile flickered across her face. "That ended months ago. It turns out I was useful to him in ways I didn't fully understand. Until recently." She hesitated. "I believe you know the feeling." The parallel was undeniable. Both of us had been valued by Drew for our professional utility as much as any personal connection. The recognition created an unexpected moment of solidarity between us. "Good luck, Dr. Mitchell," Vanessa said, extending her hand formally. "Your testimony today was extraordinary. I hope to see your independent research flourish." As I watched her walk away, I I felt the final threads of my past with Drew loosen. The complex web of personal and professional entanglements that had defined so much of my life was resolving into clearer, separate strands, allowing me to retain the valuable professional knowledge while releasing the painful personal history. 2 weeks later, Meridian Pharmaceuticals withdrew their patent challenge, citing strategic reallocation of resources rather than acknowledging the fundamental flaws in their claim. Their announced investment round was quietly restructured, with significantly reduced funding and revised commercial targets. Medcore's press release about the resolution briefly acknowledged my role. Medcore Global wishes to thank Dr. Rebecca Mitchell, whose expertise was instrumental in defending the legitimate innovation history of neuroflexin. The simple public acknowledgement represented something that had been missing throughout my years with Drew: recognition of my intellectual contribution without qualification or minimization. I celebrated the resolution not with Drew or the Medcore team, but with my own growing circle of colleagues and supporters: Sophia, Jason, Emma, and several Mitchell Fellows, whose research was now secure from the threat to their funding stream. To scientific integrity, Emma toasted, raising her glass at the small gathering in my office. And to proper attribution. And to page 7, Jason added with a knowing smile. The fine print that started it all. As conversations flowed around me, I reflected on the unexpected journey of the past year and a half. What had begun as a painful ending, divorce papers delivered on the night of Drew's triumph, had evolved into a reclamation of my intellectual identity and professional standing. The prenuptial agreement clause that Drew had overlooked had done more than secure my financial future. It had catalyzed a fundamental reassessment of my contributions and capabilities. From invisible supporter to acknowledged innovator, from behind-the-scenes contributor to public expert witness, I had reclaimed not just attribution for past work, but confidence in future possibilities. My phone buzzed with an email notification, an invitation to serve as keynote speaker at the International Conference on Neurological Binding Site Innovations. The subject line read, Dr. Mitchell, your expertise requested. Not Mrs. Mitchell, not Drew's ex-wife. Dr. Mitchell, recognized for my own expertise. I smiled, thinking of how far I had come from that shocking moment at the gala when Drew had announced our marriage was over. In trying to discard me with a settlement that valued my contributions at nothing, he had inadvertently set me on a path to proving exactly how much I was worth. All because of page 7, the fine print that finally allowed me to claim the credit I deserved. The conference hall of the Grand Hyatt in San Francisco hummed with the particular energy unique to scientific gatherings. That blend of intellectual curiosity, professional networking, and subtle competition. As the newly announced keynote, speaker for the International Conference on Neurological Binding Site Innovations, I found myself at the center of attention in a way that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. Dr. Mitchell, your recent paper on alternative receptor configurations has generated significant interest, said Dr. Amara Okafor, the conference chair, as she guided me through the preliminary reception. We've had record registrations since announcing your keynote. That's flattering, I replied, still adjusting to this new reality where my scientific insights were sought after rather than absorbed into someone else's work. Though I suspect the Meridian patent controversy might have something to do with the attention as well. Dr. Okafor smiled diplomatically. Scientific accomplishment and scientific drama aren't mutually exclusive draws. The important thing is getting researchers engaged with the fundamental questions, regardless of what initially piques their interest. She introduced me to a series of prominent neuropharmacologists and molecular researchers, many of whom I'd known for years, but primarily as Drew Mitchell's wife, rather than as a scientific peer. The subtle shift in how they addressed me directly, asked about my research rather than Drew's company, and engaged with my ideas rather than using me as a conduit to my ex-husband was both validating and bittersweet. What might my career have Been if I'd insisted on this recognition from the beginning? The thought was interrupted by a familiar voice behind me. "Mom!" Emma called, navigating through the crowd with Jason beside her. My daughter had flown in specifically for my keynote, insisting she wouldn't miss this professional milestone. "I didn't expect you until tomorrow," I said, embracing her. "We caught an earlier flight. Jason has some colleagues presenting on intellectual property and pharmaceutical development." Emma beamed with pride, though none as exciting as watching my mother headline an international conference. The casual reference to my professional accomplishment, stated as a simple fact rather than a surprising development, touched me deeply. Emma had always believed in my capabilities, even during the years when I'd subordinated them to Drew's career. "We were just heading to dinner with some of Jason's colleagues," Emma continued. "Would you like to join us? Or do you have conference obligations?" I glanced at Dr. Okafor, who waved me off graciously. "The formal proceedings don't begin until tomorrow. Enjoy your family time, Dr. Mitchell." As we left the hotel, I felt a lightness that had been increasingly common in recent months. The freedom of professional recognition without the shadow of being someone's wife, someone's support system. I was Dr. Rebecca Mitchell, respected for my own mind. "How are the preparations for your keynote coming along?" Jason asked as we settled at a waterfront restaurant overlooking the Bay Bridge. "Nearly finished," I replied, "though I'm still fine-tuning the section on future applications. The field is moving quickly since the neuroflexin variations entered clinical trials." "Speaking of which," Emma interjected, suddenly looking uncomfortable, "there's something you should know before tomorrow. Dad will be at the conference." I paused with my water glass halfway to my lips. "Drew? Why?" "MedCorp is sponsoring one of the research panels," Jason explained. "Apparently they've increased their involvement in academic conferences since the Meridian situation, emphasizing their commitment to transparent research development. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Drew's company was now promoting research transparency after years of obscuring my contributions to their breakthrough compounds. "He won't be at your keynote," Emma assured me quickly. "He's only arriving for the final day. But I thought you should know, in case you ran into him unexpectedly." I appreciated the warning, but found myself surprisingly unbothered by the prospect of Drew's presence. 6 months after the patent challenge resolution, the emotional charge of our interactions had diminished considerably. We maintained necessary, professional contact regarding the Mitchell Fellowship and ongoing patent matters, but with increasing emotional distance. "It's fine," I said honestly. "This is a professional event. We're both professionals." Emma studied me with a mixture of relief and curiosity. "You've really moved on, haven't you?" The question deserved consideration. Had I moved on? The betrayal of our marriage and Drew's attempt to minimize my intellectual contributions had been profound wounds. But the subsequent reclamation of my professional identity, culminating in this keynote invitation, had helped heal those wounds in unexpected ways. "I've moved forward," I clarified. "Not so much away from the past as toward a future I never anticipated." The following morning, I stood backstage in the main conference hall, reviewing my presentation notes one final time. The audience of over 1,000 researchers, industry, representatives, and scientific journalists represented the most significant professional platform of my career. "5 minutes, Dr. Mitchell," a young conference assistant informed me, adjusting the wireless microphone clipped to my jacket. I took a deep breath, centering myself in the moment. This presentation wasn't about Drew, or Meridian, or even the patent battle that had brought my work into public awareness. It was about the science, the elegant complexity of neurological binding sites, and the future possibilities their manipulation offered for treating previously intractable conditions. When Dr. Okafor announced my name, the applause that greeted me as I walked onto the stage felt like formal recognition of a journey that had begun in that restaurant on the night Drew handed me divorce papers wrapped as a birthday gift. "Thank I began, surveying the attentive faces before me. Today I want to discuss not just where binding site research has been, but where it's going, and specifically, how reconfiguring our approach to receptor modeling might open pathways we haven't yet considered. For the next 50 minutes, I guided the audience through the evolution of neurological binding site research, including the development path that had led to neuroflexin, now presented with my name properly included in the scientific lineage. I then outlined my recent independent work on alternative configurations that showed promise for conditions resistant to current treatments. The technical questions that followed demonstrated genuine engagement with the research, not curiosity, about the personal drama that had preceded my emergence as an independent voice in the field. By the time I left the stage, the validation was unmistakable. I belonged in this arena, not as someone's wife or support, but as a researcher with valuable insights to contribute. Emma met me in the conference center atrium, her expression radiant. "Mom, that was incredible. The modeling of alternative binding configurations was so clear, even I could follow it." "High praise from a lawyer," I teased, still riding the adrenaline wave of the successful presentation. "Dr. Mitchell," called a voice from across the atrium. I turned to find Dr. Elena Kaminsky, research director at Northstar Pharmaceuticals, one of MedCore's primary competitors. "Remarkable presentation. Would you have time to discuss potential research applications this afternoon?" Before I could respond, 2 other industry representatives approached with similar requests. By lunchtime, my conference schedule had filled. With meetings, not social courtesy extended to a former corporate spouse, but substantive discussions of potential research collaborations and consulting opportunities. Emma observed the proceedings with barely contained delight. "You realize what's happening, right? The major players in neurological pharmaceuticals are essentially bidding for your expertise." "It does seem that way," I acknowledged, both pleased and slightly overwhelmed by the attention. "Just promise me you'll let Jason review any contracts before you sign," Emma said, half joking but with lawyer's caution evident in her voice. My afternoon meeting with Elena Kaminsky proved particularly intriguing. Northstar was developing a treatment for therapy-resistant depression using binding site mechanisms similar to those I'd outlined in my presentation. "We've hit a stability roadblock in the hippocampal pathway," Elena explained, showing me molecular diagrams that reminded me of challenges we'd faced during neuroflexin's development. "Your approach to the tertiary configuration might be exactly what we need. This looks similar to an issue we resolved during early neuroflexin trials," I noted, studying the diagrams. "Have you considered modifying the receptor attachment point rather than adjusting the molecular structure?" Elena's eyes widened slightly. "That's not an approach we've explored. Would you be willing to consult on this project? With full attribution and appropriate compensation, of course," she added pointedly. The explicit mention of attribution, something I'd fought so hard to receive for my work with Drew, wasn't lost on me. Word of my settlement battle had clearly circulated throughout the industry, perhaps serving as a cautionary tale for companies working with external researchers. "I'd need to review the complete research documentation before committing," I replied, "and understand exactly how my contribution would be recognized." "Of course," Elena agreed immediately. "We could draft a consulting agreement that specifically addresses attribution rights and intellectual property considerations. Perhaps your attorney could review the terms?" "That would be advisable," I confirmed, thinking of Jason's careful guidance through the legal complexities of my new professional reality. By the end of the conference's second day, I had received 4 serious consulting inquiries and an invitation to join Northstar's Scientific Advisory Board, opportunities that would have been unimaginable 18 months earlier, when I was still defined primarily as Drew Mitchell's supportive wife. Emma and I celebrated over dinner at a small restaurant overlooking the bay, the lights of the city creating a glittering backdrop for a moment of genuine achievement. "To Dr. Rebecca Mitchell," Emma toasted, raising her wine glass. finally receiving the recognition she's always deserved. And to Emma Mitchell, I countered, who reminded her mother to read the fine print on page 7. We clinked glasses, sharing a moment of quiet triumph. The prenuptial clause that Drew had overlooked had been the catalyst, but Emma's fierce advocacy and my own rediscovered professional confidence had transformed that single legal advantage into a comprehensive reclamation of my intellectual identity. "I've been thinking," Emma said after a moment. "The Mitchell Fellowship has been so successful in supporting female biochemistry researchers. Have you considered expanding it?" I had, in fact, been contemplating the fellowship's future. With Neuroflexin royalties secured following the resolution of the Meridian Challenge, the program had stable funding, but its impact could be greater. "I've been discussing options with the university," I acknowledged, "potentially increasing the number of annual recipients or expanding into related fields." "What about creating a more comprehensive initiative?" Emma suggested. "Not just financial support for research, but mentorship, legal guidance on intellectual property protection, publication support, the practical aspects that can make or break a scientific career, especially for women." The idea resonated deeply. How different might my own career have been with that kind of structured support? With mentors who helped me navigate the complex intersection of scientific contribution and proper attribution. "That's actually brilliant," I said, considering the possibilities. "A program specifically designed to ensure female researchers receive proper credit and protection for their intellectual contributions." Emma smiled. "Maybe call it the Page 7 Initiative, to remind everyone to read the fine print." The name was perfect, acknowledging both the specific clause that had changed my life and the broader principle of vigilance regarding one's intellectual rights. "I'll start drafting a proposal tomorrow," I decided, energized by the concept of transforming my personal victory into systematic support for other researchers. The final day of the conference brought the panel discussion sponsored by MedCore, global and, as Emma had warned, Drew's presence at the event. I first glimpsed him in the exhibition hall, surrounded by company representatives and industry colleagues, looking essentially unchanged despite the seismic shifts in our personal and professional relationship. I had just finished a conversation with potential research collaborators when I turned and found Drew standing a few feet away, clearly having waited for an opportunity to approach. "Becca," he greeted me, using my familiar name despite the formal setting. "Congratulations on your keynote. I heard it was exceptional." "Thank you," I replied, maintaining professional courtesy. "Are you presenting on the MedCore panel this afternoon?" He nodded. "Discussing transparent research documentation practices and collaborative attribution models." The irony of Drew Mitchell presenting on attribution best practices hung between us, acknowledged but unspoken. "An important topic," I observed neutrally. An awkward silence followed, the remnants of 26 years together making small talk surprisingly difficult. We had moved from intimate partners to legal adversaries to reluctant allies against Meridian's fraudulent claims, and now stood as professional peers with a complicated history. "I saw the announcement about your consulting arrangement with North Star," Drew said finally. "They're fortunate to have your expertise." The comment seemed genuine rather than competitive or resentful, perhaps the closest thing to an acknowledgement of my value that Drew could offer outside of legal compulsion. "The binding site stability issue in their depression treatment is fascinating," I replied, sticking to professional substance rather than personal subtext. "Similar to challenges we faced with early Neuroflexin configurations." "That was your particular insight," Drew noted, surprising me with the unsolicited attribution. "The stability mechanism you sketched out at the kitchen counter that Sunday morning, I remember thinking it was brilliant." The casual acknowledgement, offered now without legal pressure, stirred complex emotions. Where was this recognition when it mattered? When we were building Emerald Bay together? When he was accepting awards for innovations I had helped develop? "Well," I said, keeping my voice even. Proper attribution matters, as I'm sure you'll discuss in your panel presentation. Drew accepted the subtle rebuke with a nod. The company has implemented comprehensive attribution protocols for all research. Contributions. Your case was instructive. Before I could respond, Elena Kaminsky appeared at my elbow. Rebecca, there you are. We have the molecular models ready for your review before the afternoon session. Of course, I replied, grateful for the timely interruption. Drew, good luck with your panel. As I walked away with Elena, I felt Drew's gaze following me, perhaps finally seeing me clearly as the scientist I had always been, rather than the supportive wife I had allowed myself to become. The remainder of the conference passed without further significant interaction with Drew. We maintained professional distance, acknowledging each other at shared sessions, but otherwise operating in separate spheres. Him with MedCore's corporate contingent, me with my growing network of research collaborators and potential partners. On the flight back to Seattle, I reflected on the strange circular journey of the past 18 months. The divorce that had initially felt like an ending had instead catalyzed a new beginning. The prenuptial clause that Drew had overlooked had opened a door not just to financial security, but to reclaiming my intellectual identity. And the subsequent patent battle had established my independent expertise in ways that might never have happened otherwise. You seem contemplative, Emma observed from the seat beside me. Just thinking about unexpected paths, I replied. If you had told me 2 years ago that Drew serving me divorce papers would ultimately lead to keynoting an international conference and launching an initiative to protect female researchers' intellectual property, life's most interesting. Developments rarely follow a linear path, Emma noted with the wisdom that sometimes made her seem older than her years. The most valuable molecules often emerge from failed experiments, right? The analogy was apt. The failed experiment of my marriage had yielded unexpected compounds: professional independence, restored confidence, and new purpose. Upon returning to Seattle, I threw myself into developing the Page 7 initiative with characteristic thoroughness. Working with the university's development office, I crafted a comprehensive program that would provide female biochemistry researchers with not just financial support, but practical resources for navigating the complex terrain of intellectual property protection. The initiative will include legal workshops on patent protection, publication strategy guidance, mentorship from established researchers, and a framework for ensuring proper attribution in collaborative projects, I explained. To the university president at our proposal meeting, this addresses a significant gap in how we prepare researchers, she agreed, reviewing the materials. The technical aspects of scientific training rarely include these practical professional protections, particularly for women. The Mitchell Fellowship Endowment would provide initial funding, but for the expanded vision, we would need additional resources. To my surprise, several pharmaceutical companies expressed interest in supporting the initiative, perhaps seeing strategic value in being associated with research integrity and proper attribution in the wake of the very public Meridian patent dispute. More surprisingly, 3 months after the conference, I received an email from Drew. Rebecca, I've been following the development of your Page 7 initiative with interest. The proposed attribution protection framework addresses issues that extend well beyond our personal history and could establish important precedents for the industry. MedCore's board has authorized me to offer substantial funding support for the initiative, with no strings attached regarding implementation or recognition. This is not an attempt at personal reconciliation, but professional acknowledgement of valuable work. If you're amenable, Catherine Williams can discuss specifics with your team. Regards, Drew. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to discern its true motivation. Was this genuine professional support? A public relations move to associate MedCore with research integrity? An attempt at personal atonement disguised as corporate philanthropy? Perhaps it was all of these simultaneously, just as my own motivation, For creating the initiative stemmed from both personal experience and broader professional concerns. I forwarded the message to Emma and Jason for their perspective before crafting a careful response. Drew, thank you for MedCore's interest in the Page 7 initiative. The program aims to create systemic protections that might have prevented our own attribution dispute, so there's a certain symmetry to your support. I welcome Catherine's input on the funding structure, with the understanding that the initiative will maintain complete independence regarding implementation and focus. Regards, Rebecca. The exchange represented something new in our post-divorce relationship, not the antagonism of the settlement battle or the strategic alliance against Meridian, but a measured professional respect born of difficult history and hard-earned lessons. 2 weeks later, I sat across from Catherine Williams in my office, discussing the specifics of MedCore's proposed contribution to the Page 7 initiative. The board has approved $2.5 million in initial funding, Catherine explained, with potential for renewal based on program outcomes. The figure was substantial, enough to significantly expand the initiative's scope and reach. And the terms? I asked, remembering Drew's assurance of no strings attached. Just the standard reporting requirements for corporate philanthropy, Catherine confirmed, sliding a document across the desk. MedCore has no control over program implementation, participant selection, or curriculum development. I reviewed the agreement carefully, finding it remarkably straightforward. MedCore would be recognized as a founding supporter, but the initiative would remain under my direction through the university's research foundation. This is surprisingly uncomplicated, I observed, looking up from the document. Catherine smiled slightly. Drew was quite explicit about that. He said, and I quote, "The only string attached should be that it actually helps female researchers protect their intellectual contributions." The sentiment was ironic coming from the man who had fought to minimize recognition of my contributions. But perhaps that was precisely the point. Our conflict had been costly, financially, professionally, personally, and had ultimately benefited neither of us. The initiative offered a way to prevent similar disputes for the next generation of researchers. Well, I said, signing the agreement, we can certainly deliver on that objective. With MedCore's contribution secured, the Page 7 initiative quickly gained momentum. Additional corporate sponsors came forward. The university expanded its administrative support, and applications from potential participants exceeded our initial capacity. 6 months after the San Francisco conference, I stood in the university's Grand Hall at the initiative's formal launch event, addressing a room filled with female biochemistry researchers, corporate representatives, academic partners, and media. The Page 7 initiative begins from a simple premise, I explained to the attentive audience. That brilliant scientific minds deserve not just the opportunity to make discoveries, but the certainty that those discoveries will be properly attributed and protected. As I outlined the program's components, from legal workshops to publication, strategy guidance to mentorship networks, I saw heads nodding throughout the audience. These concerns resonated far beyond my personal experience, touching on fundamental issues of equity and recognition in scientific research. The initiative's name comes from a prenuptial agreement clause that I discovered during my divorce, I continued, deciding to acknowledge the personal genesis directly. Page 7 contained language protecting intellectual property developed, with the substantive contribution of both parties, language that ultimately ensured proper attribution for my scientific work after decades of unrecognized contribution. Murmurs rippled through the audience, some already familiar with my story, others hearing the personal dimension for the first time. But this initiative isn't about one person's experience, I emphasized. It's about creating systemic protections, so that no researcher has to fight for recognition that should have been automatic. It's about ensuring that intellectual contribution is acknowledged from the beginning, not bargained for after the fact. From the back of the hall, I spotted Emma watching with visible pride. Beside her stood Lawrence Peters, my former advisor, whose meticulous records had proven so crucial in establishing my contribution to neuroflexin. And to my surprise, Drew had also chosen to attend, standing separately near the side entrance, present but unobtrusive. The future of scientific innovation depends not just on brilliant ideas, but on proper attribution of those ideas, I concluded. The Page 7 initiative aims to ensure that no brilliant mind goes uncredited and no significant contribution goes unrecognized. Because proper attribution isn't just about individual credit, it's about the integrity of the scientific enterprise itself. The applause that followed felt like affirmation not just of the initiative's goals, but of the difficult journey that had led to this moment. From the kitchen counter discussions where neuroflexin's binding site mechanism had first taken shape, to the painful discovery of unacknowledged contributions, to the hard-won recognition secured through that overlooked prenuptial clause. Each step had contributed to this new beginning. After the formal presentation, I moved through the reception, engaging with researchers eager to participate in the initiative's programs. Many shared stories of their own attribution challenges, contributions, minimized, ideas appropriated, credit diverted to more senior or male colleagues. "Your experience resonated with me," said a young researcher from Stanford. "I've been working on a promising modification to cancer treatment protocols, but my lab director presents the work as primarily his conception." The initiative's first legal workshop is specifically addressing collaborative research attribution, I told her, and we'll be developing resources for navigating exactly that kind of situation. As the evening progressed, I found myself approached by unexpected figures from my past, former Emerald Bay colleagues who had witnessed my unacknowledged contributions, academic connections who had lost touch after I stepped back from formal research to support Drew's career. "I always wondered why your name never appeared on those early papers," admitted Dr. Robert Chen, who had collaborated with Drew during Emerald Bay's formative years. "The binding site approach had your fingerprints all over it. Scientific attribution has historically depended too much on position and institutional power," I replied diplomatically, avoiding direct criticism of Drew at an event partly funded by his company. "The initiative aims to create more objective standards for proper recognition." Eventually, Drew himself approached, maintaining a respectful distance appropriate to our complex history. "Impressive turnout," he observed, gesturing to the crowded hall. "The initiative clearly addresses a significant need." "Yes," I agreed simply. There seemed little point in adding that the need existed partly because of practices he had perpetuated. We both knew that truth without it being stated. "The attribution protection framework you've developed could become an industry standard," Drew continued, surprising me with his focus on the substantive aspects rather than social pleasantries. "Catherine mentioned you're creating a model policy for research organizations." "We are. The legal team has been developing templates that companies and universities could adopt to ensure proper documentation of intellectual contributions from the beginning of projects." Drew nodded thoughtfully. "MedCorp would be interested in being an early adopter once the templates are finalized." The irony of Drew Mitchell positioning his company as a leader in attribution protection wasn't lost on either of us. But perhaps that too was part of the point. Who better to champion attribution rights than someone who had learned their importance through costly litigation? 2 years after the launch of the Page 7 initiative, I stood at the podium in the university's Benaroya Hall, preparing to introduce our second cohort of program participants. The audience included not just researchers and corporate sponsors, but representatives from 5 major universities interested in implementing similar programs. "When we began this journey," I said, surveying the faces before me, "we hoped to create a resource that would help female researchers protect their intellectual contributions. What we've discovered is that proper attribution isn't just a women's issue. It's fundamental to scientific integrity across the entire research community." The initiative had evolved beyond my initial vision, expanding to include specialized tracks for different scientific disciplines and research environments. What had begun as a response to my personal experience had transformed into a movement for transparency and recognition that transcended individual grievances. After the ceremony, I chatted with several participants whose careers had flourished with the initiative's support. Dr. Sophia Kwan had secured independent funding for her depression treatment research, with patents properly listing her as primary inventor. Dr. Mei Lin had successfully negotiated attribution protections before joining a major pharmaceutical research team. Each success story represented a future researcher who wouldn't have to discover on her 55th birthday that decades of intellectual contribution had gone unrecognized. Later that evening, as I gathered my materials to leave, I found Emma waiting in the lobby, accompanied by Jason and their 8-month-old daughter, Lydia. The sight of my granddaughter's chubby-cheeked smile provided a heart-lifting counterpoint to the professional satisfaction of the day. "There's Grandma, the science celebrity," Emma teased, transferring Lydia into my eager arms. "We thought we'd surprise you with dinner to celebrate the new cohort launch." Over dinner at a quiet restaurant near the harbor, I savored the personal joy that had accompanied my professional resurrection. Emma and Jason had welcomed Lydia into the world the previous year, giving me a new role that balanced the intensity of rebuilding my career. Grandmother and scientific pioneer, dual identities that enriched rather than competed with each other. The university president mentioned they're considering naming the new biochemistry research wing after you, Emma mentioned as we finished our meal. Quite a change from 2 years ago. The observation caught me by surprise. "After me? That seems premature." "Mom, you've transformed how an entire industry thinks about intellectual attribution," Emma pointed out. "The Page 7 protocols are being adopted by research organizations internationally. That's legacy-level impact." I shook my head, still adjusting to this new reality where my contributions were not just acknowledged but celebrated. It's still strange sometimes, after so many years of being in the background. "You were never actually in the background," Emma corrected gently. "You were just being positioned there by circumstances and people who benefited from minimizing your role. The work itself, your insights, your innovations, was always foreground material." As if summoned by this discussion of the past, my phone lit up with a notification, an email from Drew. While we maintained necessary professional contact regarding the initiative he partly funded, our personal interaction had diminished to occasional civility at unavoidable events. "Everything okay?" Emma asked, noting my expression as I read the message. "Your father wants to meet," I said, surprised by the request. "MedCorp is considering a major expansion of their attribution protection protocols and wants my input before finalizing the policy." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Professional consultation?" "Apparently." I put the phone away, returning my attention to Lydia, who was happily gumming a breadstick. "I'll deal with it tomorrow." The following afternoon, I met Drew at a small coffee shop near my office, neutral territory for what had become our established mode of interaction, professionally respectful, personally distant. "Thanks for meeting," he said as I joined him at a corner table. He looked older than I remembered from our last encounter 6 months earlier. New lines around his eyes, a slight stoop to his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Your email mentioned attribution protocols," I prompted, preferring to focus on business rather than personal observations. Drew nodded, sliding a folder across the table. MedCorp is implementing comprehensive attribution documentation for all research contributions, including retrospective recognition of previously uncredited work. I opened the folder, scanning the detailed policy framework that incorporated many elements from the Page 7 initiative's recommended protocols. "This is thorough. Why do you need my input?" Drew hesitated, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "Because you're the expert on uncredited contribution. And because..." He paused again. "Because MedCorp wants to formally acknowledge all researchers who contributed significantly to our key patents, including those whose work predated proper attribution practices. Understanding dawned. You're conducting a historical review of attribution across all major patents. Yes, starting with neuroflexin and extending to all significant compounds developed during Emerald Bay and early Medcore periods. Drew met my gaze directly. It's the right thing to do professionally. And personally, it's overdue. The gesture was meaningful, not just acknowledging my contributions, which had already been legally established, but potentially recognizing other researchers whose work had been similarly absorbed without proper credit during Drew's rise to pharmaceutical prominence. I'll review the proposal, I agreed, though I'd suggest involving independent evaluators without historical connection to the company for the actual attribution assessment. Drew nodded, accepting the boundary I'd established. Of course, we've already contracted with a scientific review board. He hesitated again. There's something else I wanted to discuss, unrelated to Medcore. I raised an eyebrow, waiting. I've been invited to guest lecture at Stanford next semester, he continued, on pharmaceutical development history, including the evolution of attribution practices. They've specifically requested that I address the neuroflexin case study and the subsequent impact on industry standards. And? I prompted, sensing there was more. And I want to ensure my presentation accurately reflects your role in contributions. I don't want to perpetuate any misrepresentations, even unintentionally. The request was unexpected, Drew voluntarily seeking guidance on how to properly credit my work in an academic setting without legal compulsion or financial incentive. I appreciate that, I said after a moment. Perhaps the most straightforward approach would be for me to review the relevant sections of your presentation before you finalize it. Relief flickered across his face. That would be helpful. Thank you. As we concluded our meeting and prepared to leave, Drew paused. The Page 7 initiative has become something remarkable, he said, genuine admiration evident in his voice, far beyond what I think either of us envisioned initially. It filled a need that extended beyond my personal experience, I acknowledged. Though that experience was certainly the catalyst. Drew nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the most important innovations come from addressing personal problems and discovering they're actually systemic issues in disguise. The observation was insightful and ironically applicable to the binding site mechanism that had made neuroflexin possible, which had emerged from addressing a specific molecular challenge rather than pursuing a theoretical breakthrough. True in science and in life, I agreed as we parted ways. The Stanford presentation materials arrived 3 weeks later. Comprehensive slides detailing the development history of neuroflexin, including explicit acknowledgement of my foundational research and ongoing contributions throughout the compound's evolution. Drew had even included several diagrams from my original doctoral work, properly attributed, showing the clear lineage from my early receptor configuration studies to the final breakthrough binding mechanism. As I reviewed the materials, I felt an unexpected emotion. Not vindication or satisfaction, but a quiet sense of things finally settling into their proper order. The attribution I'd fought so hard to secure was now being voluntarily extended, not just in legal documents but in academic presentation of the scientific history. I made minor edits to the technical explanations and returned the materials with a brief note. This is an accurate representation of the development process. Good luck with the lecture series. 6 months later, I received an invitation to speak at a pharmaceutical innovation conference in Boston, the same event where Drew and I had first met 30 years earlier, when I was presenting my doctoral research and he was a promising young scientist seeking industry applications for receptor modification theories. The symmetry was striking. 3 decades ago, that conference had set in motion a personal and professional partnership that would culminate in breakthrough drugs, a bitter divorce, and eventually an industry-changing initiative for proper attribution. Now I was returning as Dr. Rebecca Mitchell, keynote speaker rather than supporting spouse, recognized expert, rather than uncredited contributor. My presentation focused on the future of binding site research, particularly applications for conditions resistant to current treatment approaches. But I concluded with reflections on the broader significance of attribution in scientific innovation. The molecules we develop exist independently of who receives credit for their discovery, I told the audience. A binding mechanism works whether it's properly attributed or not. But the scientists who develop these innovations, especially those from underrepresented groups, experience the attribution gap profoundly. Their careers, opportunities, and legacies depend on proper recognition. I paused, surveying the room filled with researchers, industry representatives, and students who represented the next generation of pharmaceutical innovation. When I discovered page 7 of my prenuptial agreement, I found more than a legal clause protecting intellectual property. I found validation of a principle that should be fundamental to scientific research, that ideas deserve recognition regardless of who generates them, and that innovation thrives when contribution is properly acknowledged. The applause that followed felt like closure to a chapter that had begun in that restaurant on my 55th birthday, when Drew had handed me divorce papers and inadvertently set me on a path to reclaiming not just financial security, but intellectual identity. After the presentation, I found myself approached by a young female researcher, clutching a conference program and looking nervous. Dr. Mitchell, your work on the alternative binding site configurations is directly relevant to my doctoral research, she began. I was wondering if I could ask about potential applications for treatment-resistant anxiety disorders. Of course, I replied, delighted by her technical question rather than interest in the personal drama that had sometimes overshadowed my scientific contributions. The limbic pathway modification shows particular promise for anxiety manifestations resistant to current SSRI approaches. As we delved into the molecular specifics, I glimpsed the future of the field, bright minds building on established research, properly attributing foundational work while pushing boundaries with new insights. This was the scientific legacy I had fought to establish, not just for myself, but for researchers who would follow. Later that evening, at the conference reception, I encountered several colleagues from my early career, researchers who had known me before I stepped back to support Drew's work, now engaging with me as a respected peer whose contributions to the field were finally receiving proper recognition. Your binding site modification approach has transformed how we approach receptor configuration, noted Dr. Thomas Chen, a longtime researcher at MIT. We're seeing applications far beyond the original neurological focus. The most valuable innovations often have implications beyond their intended scope, I agreed, thinking of how my fight for personal attribution had expanded into an initiative with industry-wide impact. As I prepared to return to Seattle the following day, I received a text message from Emma. How was the keynote? Did Boston bring back memories? It had, but not in the way she might have assumed. Rather than dwelling on the past, on opportunities, missed or contributions uncredited, I had found myself firmly rooted in the present, engaged with current research and future possibilities. The keynote went well, I replied, and yes, plenty of memories. But mostly I'm thinking about what comes next. And what came next was increasingly defined by possibility rather than retrospection. The Mitchell biochemical consulting firm was expanding, adding associates to handle growing demand for expertise in neurological binding site applications. The Page 7 initiative was establishing international chapters, creating attribution protection frameworks for researchers across multiple scientific disciplines. And my personal research continued to explore binding site modifications with potential applications for previously untreatable conditions. The prenuptial clause that Drew had overlooked had done more than secure proper attribution for past contributions. It had catalyzed a fundamental recalibration of my professional identity and scientific legacy. From invisible supporter to acknowledged innovator, from behind-the-scenes contributor to public pioneer, I had traversed the distance between accepting nothing and claiming everything I had rightfully earned. The binding site mechanism that had launched Drew's career and established his company's success had finally received proper attribution, with my name rightfully included in the scientific lineage. But more importantly, the experience had created a framework ensuring that future researchers wouldn't need to discover overlooked prenuptial clauses to receive proper credit for their intellectual contributions. Sometimes I reflected as my plane departed Boston. The most important discoveries aren't made in laboratories, but in unexpected places, like page 7 of a prenuptial agreement, where the fine print might just contain your true value. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.